want to tell you that the most important thing to keep in mind is that we will get through this. However, it is not likely when we get to the point where we get through this to end well. On the other hand, as you will find, those of you who read this book, which is the sequel to my biography of Trump from 2 years ago, The Making of Donald Trump, Donald Trump is not the disease. He's the symptom. The disease is that we in America for decades now, and I would date this to the late 70s to early 80s, have been giving up democracy. In the 2016 election, close to 100 million people who were eligible to vote did not cast ballots. Young people, 18 to 21, whose parents and grandparents, like me, had sought the right to vote on the theory that, well, if you can draft us and kill us in Vietnam, we ought to have a right to vote, turned out in relatively low numbers. I suspect because of Parkland and the reaction of the students there, led by the students who take part in a national award-winning high school broadcast journalism program, that's about to change. But what we need to keep in mind is a simple, fundamental truth that we don't spend enough time thinking about and that we do not teach well in our schools, many of which no longer teach what those of us with gray hair remember to be in junior high school and high school civics. And that is the whole idea of the United States of America is that we choose our future. We've made a bad choice. We've made a terrible mistake. And it was a minority of us who made that mistake. What happened is that we've allowed our Constitution to atrophy in many areas. And one of them is the Electoral College, which is what put Donald Trump in the White House. Why do we have the Electoral College? Most people, when I ask them that, always say, well, so the small states have some influence. And that's true. But there was a second reason that the framers of our Constitution wrote about. They were very concerned about the mob, and they called the popular vote the mob. They had read their Athenian history. They had read their Roman history, and they were very worried about the mob. So they put in these checks and balances, one of which was designed that if it ended up that we had a zealot, someone who was manifestly unfit to be president, a crazy person, a criminal, that the Electoral College would step forward and say, no, we are not going to allow you to become president. Well, we got a crazy person who's a criminal, who's unfit to hold office, and only about 6 people in the Electoral College said no. The electors failed as the first check on the executive. Journalists failed too. The news coverage of this campaign was absolutely awful. And I don't just tell that to you. I was on a panel at City University of New York a couple of weeks after the votes in 2016, and one of the people on the panel was the political editor of the New York Times, where I worked for 13 years. And I started off my talk by saying, I love the New York Times. I'm very glad that I worked at the New York Times. I'm very proud. There's no newspaper in the world as good as the New York Times, flaws and all. But the New York Times coverage of Donald Trump in this campaign was absolutely disastrous and indefensible. And I went through what voters weren't told. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand unless you learned what I asked you about from reading my book, okay? And then I'm going to have you keep your hand up. I want you to raise your hand if you know this, but keep your hand up. How many of you know that Donald Trump spent most of the 1980s deeply entangled with a major international cocaine trafficker he did favors for, whose case was moved from Ohio to the New Jersey courtroom of Judge Marianne Trump Berry? How many knew that from my books or seeing me? Almost nobody knows that. You are better informed, I assure you, than the average audience in America. People don't know this. They're not aware of it. And I've said publicly repeatedly when I say what Donald Trump did with Joseph Wexelbaum, a twice convicted felon after the DEA caught him, a 3-time convicted felon, makes no sense whatsoever.
Hey, what's up, everybody? How are you doing? I'm hoping that you are doing super great from wherever you're watching me from. I'm your host and presenter, G-Tech Stories, and I'm hoping that you are doing super fine from wherever you're watching me. Now, amongst the biggest problems that are happening today in the contemporary United States is the choice of the president that people chose. We have some people that argue that the problem is not the Trump, the problem is people that he works for. Some people are saying that the problem is Mr. President Trump. But what if I told you we have a professor, we have a scholar who knew Trump even before joining the presidential seat? There are a couple of things that he knew about him. And I believe that this is so much important in understanding his political career, understanding the decisions that he makes, in as much as he's one of the oligarchs. But you might want to ask yourself, where did this problem started? The person that I'm going to be presenting, or the person that is going to be giving the speech, is called David Cay Johnston. Probably some of you know him, probably some people don't know. And for those people who don't know, I'm going to go ahead and introduce this professor. David Cay Johnston is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and author who has spent decades covering tax policy, economic inequality, and political corruption. He is best known for his in-depth reporting of Donald Trump's business dealings long before Trump entered politics. Johnston has written several books about Trump, most notably The Making of Donald Trump, History of Deception, or The Making of Donald Trump, and It's Even Worse Than You Think, in which he exposes Trump's history of deception, legal manipulation, financial capacity, and authoritarian tendencies. His critique carries weight because it is rooted not in partisan politics, but in carefully documentation and factual scrutiny. Some people are going to be saying that, oh, this channel is for liberal lefts, and we like talking about Trump negatively, but I think this is just a scrutiny. This is just trying to look at why did this whole problem started, and when or how did majority of white America was so much convinced to do what they did. Now, one thing that is special about this video that I want to talk about is that you get to understand that this video, it talked about it like many years ago. When I say many years ago, I'm talking about he talked about it like 7 years ago, before a lot of things that we are seeing in the contemporary United States. And I want us to take our time to watch this video. It is really, really important, and it's going to be giving you, I think, an important perspective that you might want to consider listening or giving it your ear. I'm your host and presenter, G-Tech Stories. I'm hoping that you are doing fine. Now, for those who are watching me for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, join the membership, and really get so we can offer you. For those who are always coming back watching the videos, man, I'm really, really thankful for the support that you're trying to give me. But until then, let's watch the video, and then I'll be back. I'll share my commentary, I'll share my thoughts in regards to this. You also are allowed to share your thoughts to the comment section, but be kind to your friend. I know sometimes these topics get a little messy, but we are people who are civilized, and we are going to act the right way. Now let's watch the video. I'll be back, and then we'll have a proper discussion in regards to this.
Unless Donald Trump was in business with Joe Wexelbaum in drug trafficking, whereupon everything he did makes absolutely perfect sense. And it falls into the school of, Joe, I'll never rat you out. Don't worry. Just stick to your confession. Don't get me involved in this. I'll never rat you out. And I've said, if Donald Trump thinks that that's not true, I invite him to sue me. That's how firmly I think the evidence shows his conduct. Sue me. He certainly has a lot more resources than I do. Now, what's important now that Donald Trump is the President of the United States, is frankly not the crazy tweets, the racist comments, the nuttiness going on in the White House, the chaos. What matters is what is not in the news and what I wrote this book to address. Team Trump has put into our government what I call political termites. And I call them political termites because, like wood termites, you don't see them eating away at the structure of your house until one morning you walk into the kitchen and boom, your foot goes through the floor. And you've got a huge bill to repair and fix the damage. Now, Donald didn't do this personally. Donald is lazy. The White House hasn't even disputed reports that he comes to work around 11:30 and leaves around 4, and that includes lunch. He wants to get back to watching himself on Fox. But the people whose names you haven't heard, and in many cases you're not likely to hear, are the people that are doing the damage to our government, who are eating away at our substance. People have been put into these departments with the express purpose of weakening and, if they can, destroying our government. At the Environmental Protection Agency, this is perhaps better known than other places, but in my book I tell the story of a senior EPA executive, someone you and I have invested a fortune in developing knowledge and skills and talents in a very sophisticated person. And when Scott Pruitt, the former Attorney General from fossil fuels, arrived as EPA director, he did a whole bunch of interesting things we've never seen before. First of all, they put locks on the outer doors of the EPA administrator's office. Secondly, if you were called or summoned to any of the executive offices, you were stopped by a security guard. You had to leave your cell phone or anything else that might be capable of recording a conversation, and you were then brought into the offices. All conversations were one-sided conversations. The woman whom I quote at length in the book had worked under 11 EPA administrators. And she said every single one of them, they would come by her office, or they would ring her up and say, hey, can you come to my office? I got a problem. And they would discuss, well, this industry or this company or this senator has some complaint, and how do we deal with this, and what do we do? And sometimes, Betsy was happy with the outcome, and sometimes she wasn't, but it was all based on the political realities of dealing with powerful people and what the law says, not Scott Pruitt. He told her and her staff of people that you are to write highly detailed reports on every weakness in the Clean Water Act. If we bring any kind of case under the Clean Water Act, I want to know every single weakness. Now think about that for a minute. Who do you think is going to benefit from that? Do you think that it led to Scott Pruitt going to Congress and saying, we need to shore up the Clean Water Act that Richard Nixon signed in 1971? No, this was written to be a guide to polluters on how to defeat enforcement of the laws, even after this administration is gone. And the people at EPA, being good bureaucrats, did what they were told. They wrote these reports. They were summoned to a meeting. They were asked only very technical questions. What does that word mean, or why is that word there rather than somewhere else? There was no feedback. And then all the paperwork, all the documentation was taken from them. They were told to eliminate everything that they had, and they were dismissed. These are not people fulfilling their oaths. These are people who are setting out to destroy our government. I want you to notice I always talk about our government. One of the worst things the news media does is refer to the government. Now, if you're the BBC, I expect you to refer to the US government as the government. But in America, I think we need to start talking in our personal conversations and our communications with others about our government. We own it. We need to act like owners. If we do that, we will take a much deeper interest in the policies of our government. One of the principal ideas of this government is compromise. Democracy is based on the notion of compromise. Now at Syracuse, where I'm not teaching this year, but I did for 8 years, I taught the law of the ancient world. One course was the property and tax law of the ancient world. The other was the business regulatory law of the ancient world. There's an enormous amount of business regulation in Hammurabi's Code, in the Old Testament, in Athenian law, in Roman law, in Egyptian law, Chinese law, Indian law that I would teach my students because I was really teaching them, why is the law the way it is today? How did we get here? And is it arbitrary or is it based on human experience? Well, those laws, in many ways, are flawed, and I show flaws in them of all sorts of kinds, things that maybe at the time were not thought at all to be flaws, but we see today that they are as we learn new things and we acquire new things. And in the regulatory course, I would have my students 3 times spend their 3 hours together designing a regulatory system. The first time we would do one about steamboats, because after the first steamboat was crossing the Hudson River over here, other manufacturers got into it. Some of them weren't so good, and there were about 7,000 people who were scalded alive in various places across this country when badly made steam engines exploded. Well, how are we going to solve this problem? And I take the 20 or so students I have, and you're the guy who's selling it. You're the insurer. You're the banker. You're somebody standing on the dock to wave goodbye to your family because they're going to visit someone. All these different roles. And what the students the first time do is they realize they have no idea what they're doing. And then we do it a second time for the 1905 New York City dynamite law. You can't have construction in Manhattan, which is a big rock, without dynamite. They get better at it. And then we do it a third time, usually with securities laws. And by the third one, everybody has this deep appreciation that everybody else in the room has a legitimate interest and they're not the same. And you have to make compromises if you're going to have a successful regime where we can all live and get along together. That's not what's going on in this administration. This administration is the embodiment of the my way or the highway argument. And it is based largely on the whims of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who I've known for 30 years, is not a man with any philosophy at all, except I am the greatest. And this is a guy who makes Muhammad Ali, the boxer, look modest. This is a man who doesn't literally know anything. He said he's going to make Mexico pay for a wall. And he repeatedly was asked, how are you going to make Mexico pay for the wall? It's a sovereign country. Oh, I have a plan. As soon as I get in office, I'm not going to give it away. So he gets in office, and what's his plan? He's going to put a tariff on Mexican goods, which means you and I pay for the wall through higher prices, not just on Mexican goods, but if it's a 20% tariff, we're going to pay 19% higher prices on American-made goods because American companies can raise their prices just below the tariff level and expand their market share. Donald doesn't know this because he doesn't know what he's doing. Donald, I quote word for word from the book, him's arguing that he is the world's greatest expert of all time on taxes. Nobody knows more than Donald about taxes. Now, my next book is an entirely new tax system for the United States for the 21st century economy. It's a project I've spent more than a decade refining and developing and working out until now the experts in the field I take it to can't poke any holes in it. But Donald, under oath, has testified when he's asked, well, so what do you know about accounting? I don't know anything about accounting. Leave that to the accountants. Well, to claim you're an expert on taxes and then say you know nothing about taxes would be the equivalent of my standing up here and saying, you probably don't know that I am the world's greatest expert in all time on the design of airplanes. I am the greatest airplane designer ever born. What's a wing? That's how silly it is. And yet millions and millions of people believe Donald Trump is their savior. And they believe anybody who's opposed to him must be a horrible person. I get astonishing emails from people about why do I love Sharia law? I mean, I've looked all over. I had my research assistant do all sorts of looking through Nexus. I said, please find me some American politician. I don't care if it's a city council person in you never heard of it, middle of Texas, who supports Sharia law, wants to go to Sharia, can't find them. It's not really a unicorn. It's more of a chimera. Well, we have to get along with this guy, like it or not. He's got his finger on the button. At the moment, he has a Secretary of Defense who I think it's become pretty clear by his actions is not going to let him use the button. An illegal order to use it is not going to happen. And by the way, just think for a moment about what would happen if Trump went through with his casual talk about killing everybody in North Korea. 25 million people, half the population of South Korea. People who are so poor, if you look at satellite images at night, all of Asia along the coast is lit up and there's this black hole. It's North Korea. The average annual income in North Korea is the equivalent of about 10 days' income here in North Jersey. That's how little people get by on. There's widespread malnutrition. There's the use of forced slave labor in fishing and mining in Russia and China to bring foreign currency back to this failed state that's a cult where you must express your personal loyalty to the leader or terrible things will happen to you. Where people who've escaped say that they were told that they were the wealthiest people in the world. And then they get to Seoul and they discover things like ice cream and big signs on the side of buildings. They can't believe it. If we were to do what Donald Trump casually said, just nuke off the face of the earth North Korea, we would become a pariah nation. Everybody would stop doing business with us. You want to go on a vacation to Europe? I'm sorry, we don't allow Americans. We don't accept your passport. Or you'll have to go through a rigorous vetting process and get permission to come. What happened to the apartheid regime in South Africa that finally brought it to its knees under de Klerk? That would be a picnic compared to what would happen to us. Now, in the fall, I traveled around the world. I literally flew 51,000 actual air miles, lectured on 5 continents on 5 Fridays. And I was astonished everywhere I went about how uniform the reaction was to Donald Trump. And the basic reaction to people from high government officials that I met, journalists I met, academics, business leaders, down to chambermaids who I engaged in conversation, who were making up my room, was, what happened to your country? How could this happen? How could this crazy person be the president of the United States? What is wrong with you people? And they were all scared. They were all literally scared. Now, one of the things that Donald Trump promised is that he was the champion of the forgotten man. If you remember his inaugural address, the forgotten man will be forgotten no more. It took him about 5 minutes after he left the Capitol to forget the forgotten man. And in this book and in the news service that I run with my friends, it's a nonprofit, mostly volunteer project with a huge budget of about $6,000 a month, where we break story after story after story that sometimes we get the major news organizations to follow us, almost never with credit, is that he's actively going after the common man. It isn't just his, I'm going to drain the swamp, and then he stocks it with swamp monsters from Goldman Sachs. It's other things this government is doing. The first budget that Trump put forward proposed that for seniors who are between 60 and 90% disabled, veterans who are between 60 and 90% disabled, and who get treated as if they're fully disabled because basically employers don't want to hire you at that rate. And I know this because my father, I watched him after World War II go through progression until he became 100% disabled. And once he was at about 40%, nobody wants to hire you. He got hired because he was a very talented chef, but 65% or so, he couldn't work anymore. Well, Donald Trump's first budget proposed that when you reach early retirement age for Social Security, 62, that your annual income, which currently is about $35,000, be cut to $13,000. Literally plunging you into poverty. Nobody's going to take care of the veterans the way I will. Nobody. I'm going to take care of our veterans. Nobody's been taking care of them. Both parties. I'm going to take care of our veterans. Really? You're going to plunge them into poverty. Now, that's not going to happen. They dropped that because Congress said, we're not doing that. The most troglodyte members of Congress said, we're not doing that. But it's indicative of his attitude. He also proposed, by the way, and they're still working on this one in various ways, to round down all checks. So if your benefit is $3,000.99 a month, you'd lose the 99 cents. Now, it's not a lot of money. We're talking about a few $1 million in a $20 trillion economy, but the symbolism of it is overwhelming. Look at the Second Amendment. Donald Trump used to be against the kinds of weapons that are used to massacre our children. And let's not beat around the bush about it. That's what they're being used for, to massacre our children. And it is shocking to me that everybody isn't out in the streets demanding an end to this. Not just young people. We're going to find out, by the way, it's going to take you a long time to get this changed. Change does not come easily. Our government was designed to be resistant to change. The people who got these changes, they worked on it for decades. This shouldn't take decades, but it's not going to happen overnight either. Donald Trump, in every case that we have looked at dcreport.org, singular, dcreport.org, singular, his actions are inimical to the interests of ordinary Americans, inimical to the interests of the people he promised to champion. Now, where did Donald Trump get this idea that we need to drain the swamp and that Washington is taking care of itself and the political donor class at the expense of the vast majority of Americans? I know exactly where Donald got it. He got it from me. I've known Donald for 30 years. He and I have talked about these issues. I asked him one time, what do you think about healthcare as a business owner? And he said, healthcare should be just like the roads. When you need one, you just use it. You don't pay anything, you just go use it. Think about that in contrast to what he's proposing now to take away healthcare from 31 million people and enhance the power of the insurance companies. There's no moral principle here that applies to him. It's whatever is convenient in the moment. Donald very brilliantly took the message in my best-selling trilogy of books, which I know he watched me on television talk about for the 10-year period it took to write all three of them. Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and The Fine Print. And he talked to other people who, told me about these conversations where he was testing out these ideas that he was intrigued with about what I argued was, being not a marketing person like Donald, upward redistribution, stealth siphoning of money out of your pocket, and other terms like that. And Donald brilliantly distilled that into drain the swamp. Washington doesn't care about you. They're taking care of themselves and their friends. And it was a brilliant message. And in fact, in 2012, I said on one of the national TV shows that I was on, anybody who runs for president on my three books is going to get elected because of the numbers. The bottom 90% of Americans that year had smaller incomes than in 1967. People in the year 2012 in the bottom 90% worked all year to get 51.5 weeks of the income that they had in 1967 when you adjust for inflation. And on top of that, the number of them who had pensions went way down. Way down. The number of them who had fully paid health care the way I did when I was a young man, when I was a 23-year-old home-owning journalist with 5 children, and my medical bills amounted to $1 every time one of the kids needed to see a doctor, which would be about $7 today. That's all gone. We have in this country been steadily reducing what economists call returns to labor and increasing returns to capital. When the economy grows, there's only 2 places the money can go. It either goes to capital or it goes to labor. Now, you want to have good, solid returns to labor because it's to capital, because it's growing capital and the productive investment of capital that leads to jobs, that allows us to finance economic activity. But what we've been doing is two things in the last 40 years. We've been reducing the returns to labor. We've been pushing down wages for everybody below the CEO class. In fact, that's the only job in America where we strive to pay you the highest possible paycheck, because it's a rigged system in which other CEOs sit on the board, and many companies have policies that say it's the policy of our company to pay our senior executives in the top quartile, which of course means you have to keep pushing up to try to get into the top quartile. And at the same time, while getting rid of unions, only about 6% of private sector workers now are in unions, and the Trump administration is determined to completely destroy unions. So people have no bargaining power. And if you were to say to Donald Trump, you know, Pope Francis says without unions there's no economic justice, he would say, well, he's wrong. He doesn't know what he's talking about. On the other side, we are increasingly rewarding capital for investing in unproductive assets. A hedge fund is not a productive asset. A hedge fund is making money off of money, something the ancient Greeks thought was immoral, something that the Old Testament made a crime. Can't make money off money. You're going to make money, you can make money by planting a tree and getting the fruit from the tree, but you're not supposed to make money off money, especially within your own group. Maybe you can charge interest to people outside the group under certain circumstances. And you had to have provisions to help the poor. If the only thing a poor person had as security for their debt was their cloak that they slept under at night, even if they still owed you money, at the end of the day, you had to give it back to them so they wouldn't freeze to death. Who does Donald Trump nominate for a Supreme Court position that should have gone to Barack Obama? Judge Gorsuch, who in a dissent as a member of the Court of Appeals in one of the Midwestern districts, said that a truck driver who had to choose between freezing to death or violating his company's policies for which they could fire him was properly fired. In other words, in my view, he said that you should die rather than lose your job or lose your job. This is the kind of absolutely immoral people who are attracted to Donald Trump and who he is attracted to in return. And the policies that they are working to put in place are doing exactly this. Now, on Sunday, there'll be a full-page review of my book in the New York Times. It's not as hostile as the one from my book, Free Lunch, 10 years ago, in which the writer, A, never told anybody what was in the book, and B, essentially described me as being part of a Democratic Party internecine battle. It's a strange thing to accuse a reporter of, so I went to the executive editor's office and said, if you guys think this, you should fire me right now. Shouldn't even let me resign. You should just fire me. And I said, oh, by the way, I'm a registered Republican. But one of the arguments made by the guy reviewing my book is that, well, Donald really hasn't done much to weaken our government. Well, that's a perfectly good issue to debate. How much has he weakened our government? Look around and ask yourself, what do you think? If tomorrow you discover that one of the many chemical companies here in North Jersey has decided to go back to just dumping stuff in a drain, what do you think the odds are that the Justice Department under Jeff Sessions and the EPA under Pruitt are going to immediately act against that company? You going to call them or are you going to call the governor's office? That would be the question to ask yourself. If you discover that you've been had through some financial product, are you going to get the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, the great accomplishment of Elizabeth Warren beyond her study that changed what we understood about who files bankruptcy? By the way, everybody files bankruptcy roughly in proportion to their share of the population, whether you're a dentist or a banker or a hod carrier. It's part of the human condition. It's not a part of your social status. Are they going to help you? No. They're making sure that that agency is totally ineffective. An agency that, by the way, has won back for consumers about 4 times what we've spent on it. How about job exports? If you work in a job exporting business, but you're a small company or you're in a small factory, maybe you work in a place where there's 75 or 100 people in the factory. It's not General Electric or Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. It's the kind of business that we are always talking about is so wonderful, the mom and pop business, the kind of corporation that my oldest son and I started here in New Jersey, and he still runs successfully. Well, we have a federal agency to help little exporters. If you're General Electric or Boeing, the biggest exporter we have, you have a whole staff of people who scour the world selling your products. But what if you're doing $10 million a year in sales? You can't have offices all over the world. You probably can't afford to have one. So our federal government has a program. It's absolutely a subsidy program to help these small exporters of manufactured goods get their products out there, to work through the red tape of other countries, and to be successful in promoting sales. The way that we historically have measured this agency, for every dollar of subsidy we put into it as taxpayers, these outfits sell $850 worth of goods overseas. So if you assume the profit margin they have is 10%, which is a reasonable number for a manufacturer, that means that we get $85 of profit for every dollar we spend. Trump wants to get rid of it, or at least the team he brought in, the political termites who are there to destroy the government, they want to get rid of it. Who benefits from doing that? Well, not the forgotten man who works in the small manufacturing company, but it might help big companies that are less efficient or that don't want to face competition. And the less competition, of course, the higher prices are, the less efficient the economy is, and the fewer benefits you get from market capitalism, which is all based on competition. Now, we aren't going to see anything change with the current Congress. From now till next January 3rd, barring something absolutely unexpected, Donald Trump suddenly starts tearing his clothes off and screaming the Martians are coming. I mean, it would have to be that crazy. Nothing's going to change. The leaders in Congress, Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, have made it perfectly clear that they are not even protecting the perquisites and the institutional interests of the House and the Senate, because they have decided they're better off with Donald Trump than any other option open to them. The most important election in this country since the Civil War, and I include 1932, when this country could have become a fascist country, it could have become a communist country, it could have fallen into uncontrolled violence. The most important election in this country since the Civil War is this fall. And I say that because if we don't get a new Congress, if you're a Republican, if you don't follow the advice of Max Boot, a prominent conservative thinker and writer, that it is the duty of every Republican to vote out the Republican members of the House and Senate unless they've stood up to Donald Trump, I have a pretty good idea of where I think things are going to go. And let me just tell you, I have a track record of going to editors and proposing things and writing about things that turn out years later to be correct. I left the LA Times and went to the Philadelphia Inquirer because I said casinos are going to spread all across America, and I had structural reasons it was going to happen. And the editors of the LA Times said, that's crazy, you can't predict what's going to happen in 25 years. I even picked the states the casinos spread to in 1992, named them, and got almost every one of them right. I believe that if we maintain the current Congress we have, here's what's going to happen. Somebody will come along running for president who does not have Donald Trump's deficits. That is, somebody who's actually smart, somebody who is highly educated, somebody who has real management skills, someone who knows how to build wealth in their business rather than doing what Donald does, which is extract cash as fast as he can and not pay people and then move on to the next mark, because that's what con artists do. Somebody who has the same charisma that Donald Trump has. They're going to come along and they're going to be in the White House. And then we're really going to be in deep trouble. It will be the end of our individual liberties. It will be the rise of an authoritarian state of the kind that Donald Trump clearly wants. Look at who he praises. When Erdogan wins his rigged election in Turkey that puts him this far from being a dictator, this far from turning a country that has been secular since Ataturk came to power in 1905 and turning it into an Islamic state, one Western leader called to praise him, Donald Trump. Donald Trump, when he ran for office, constantly attacked what I call the 9 thugs who run China, a communist dictatorship with Chinese characteristics of capitalism, a place where they shoot people, they beat people to death if they don't follow the party line. You try to organize a union not approved by the government in China, the local police will kill you. And there'll be no retribution or punishment for them. They'll do it with impunity. As soon as Donald Trump gets in office and he gets all these additional intellectual property rights and his daughter Ivanka gets them in time like this, just incredible how quickly they were approved. Mere coincidence, the Chinese government says. Suddenly, President Xi is this great guy. And who does Donald Trump constantly talk about as a model? Vladimir Putin, a man who poisons people, a man who had his most prominent political opponent not just shot to death, and not just shot to death on the streets, but shot to death at a point where the cameras of both the official Russian news agencies, which is to say their propaganda agencies, and the West, would shoot pictures of the dead body and the background would be the Kremlin so that no one missed getting the message. You mess with Vladimir Putin, he'll kill you. These are the people Donald Trump admires because he's an authoritarian. Donald believes you are supposed to be loyal to him, as he tried to get James Comey to do. He believes you exist to help him. And by the way, Donald believes, and he's not corrupt about this, he believes that of course he should be president of the United States. He should run the whole world. He is genetically superior to you and me. He's smarter than us. He has the world's greatest memory. He intuitively knows things so well that in 90 minutes he can learn everything you need to know about nuclear-tipped missiles. 90 minutes. Ask Barack Obama, who wrote his senior thesis on that subject, how long it took him. And he doesn't pretend to be an expert on that subject. If we don't get a new Congress, and I don't mean a new Congress with a margin of a few votes, I mean a new Congress. If we don't get a Senate that won't convict when provided with evidence of corruption and, more importantly, disloyalty by Donald Trump, we're going to see the end, within the lifetime of the young people sitting in this room, of the America we know. We created this country to ennoble the human spirit, to see what people could achieve. We created this country at great risk. All of the most wealthy and successful people in this country, except in Philadelphia, would have been hung had they not been successful in the guerrilla attack on the British. And thank God the British were busy pursuing other things, so we got their fifth-rate General Cornwallis and we could beat them. We founded this country so that we wouldn't have a state religion, so that we wouldn't have a king telling us what to do, so that we could choose our destiny. There are a lot of people who really don't like that. They would rather have a government that tells you what to do. So this election, people need to be, first and foremost, they need to vote. All the rest of this, the TV shows that I and other people appear on, the debates in Congress, they don't matter. Not compared to who votes. People need to register to vote. There's 100 million people out there in round numbers who we need to not only get registered if they're not, but get them to the polls. If you live in a district where you're totally happy with your member of Congress, and be very cautious about that, even if you're a Dem and the person is a Dem. You know, there's lots of research that people say, I hate Congress, but I love my congressperson. Well, that's not, no. You got to look cold-bloodedly at your existing congressperson and whether they need to go. And when election time comes, in advance, you need to call up people in districts where getting a turnout matters. Gerrymandering can be defeated. The math of gerrymandering is you create districts that favor your party by 54, 55 at the most percent. 53 is the number you target for, but 53 or 54. Turn out the vote, you can defeat that. Then it means you have to organize in advance and call people and get in a car, and you have to have 2 people in a car and go drive people to the polls. Because at the end of the day, in a democracy, the thing that matters is who votes and who they vote for. Now, if Donald Trump is impeached and removed from office, you know what he will do, because he's already done it. He will spend the rest of his days going around the country fomenting violence against the United States of America, because during the campaign, when he was seeking votes, hey, I want you to vote for me, what would he do? Beat that person up. Get that thug out of here. Go ahead, I'll pay your legal bills if you beat him up. Imagine if he's out of office and humiliated, what he would do. If he is voted out of office in the primaries, and there are going to be primary challenges to him in 2020 if he's still in office, or he's voted out of office in the general election, we already know what he's going to do. It was rigged. I really won the vote. It's all those illegals who voted, the people that, that voted for Hillary. It was totally corrupt. It was illegal. The Russians helped the other party or the primary challenger. So if Donald Trump is not impeached, convicted, which takes 67 votes, and then prosecuted, convicted, and sent to prison, we will, for the rest of his life, face violence in the streets over this. I don't mean full-scale riots, but there will be trouble. The Comet Pizza Shop case, Hillary Clinton's supposed pedophile ring in the pizza store in D.C., is not going to be an anomaly anymore. But we need to do whatever it takes to get this unqualified, crazy, at times delusional, and totally self-centered man out of our White House. And we need to take back our government. Thank you. So I'm going to take questions from people, and the only thing I ask you to do is ask a question, because there are other people going to want to ask questions. If you give a speech, I'll cut you off, and I'll say, figure out the question, I'll come back to you. But who has questions? Sir, you first, then you.
I think that there was a reason why Donald Trump was elected. And it was that there was a great dissatisfaction for the condition of the United States,
Yes,
at least in a certain
I agree. So
area.
what's the question?
The question is, if we concentrate only on how bad Donald Trump is, and we don't concentrate on resolving the problem that elected him, do we run the risk of having Donald Trump on 2020?
I love that question. If you can pass the microphone down to the lady down here. As I said during my talk, the 90% of Americans in 2012 had less income than in 67, and their income's just barely gone up from them. And when you look at their total circumstances, they're worse. 50% of Americans today live in economic terror. We're in a prosperous area right here. Get in a plane, fly to Nebraska, and drive across the state. Stop in every town of any size and get a hotel room, and you will be shocked at how awful it is. You may even be scared if you go to a coffee shop in the middle of the night and how many people around you are tweaking on meth. And yes, we have to get going. If Donald Trump had come into office and the first thing he had done was an infrastructure program, the Democrats, would have had to go with him, and it would have created an enormous amount of jobs. I was on a radio show, 10 years ago with a congressman. I didn't even know who he was. I didn't even know I was going to be on with him. And the congressman was asked, I was talking about infrastructure, and particularly roads, and he said, we can't afford to fix up our roads. There's no money. And I said, really? Well, Congressman, how do you expect the grapefruit growers in Texas and the tomato growers in Texas and the dairy companies in Wisconsin to get their products to market if we don't fix up our roads? That's ridiculous. We have to fix and maintain our infrastructure. And I said, you go to China, the roads in China are unbelievable. Their highways, they put the Autobahn to shame, which puts our interstates to shame. Yeah, we have to have a whole lot of reforms. We have to get and make it possible for people to organize so they can negotiate for their wages and their benefits. When 37% of private sector workers belonged to unions, which was the case in 1973, 80% of workers benefited. We have to go back to making college what it was when I went to college, free or virtually free. It shouldn't be a loan program. And the reward we get for that as a society for investing in young minds is they make more wages and we tax them in the future. We have to do a whole lot of things that need change. That's why we need a whole new Congress. And the conditions that got Donald Trump elected are not going to change without major changes in who we put in office. Absolutely. And that includes lots of Democrats.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing super great from wherever you are watching me from. Now, there are a couple of things, and I like the takedown of Mr. Donald Trump, the way he describes him. This is a person that has studied Mr. Donald Trump for the longest time, and I think from the perspective that he gives, he definitely knows what he's talking about. Now, I want to talk about something that is really, really important. The Trump persona, myth versus reality, that Mr. David Cay Johnston tried to share. Now, the main part of argument, Johnston's core argument, is that Donald Trump is a manufactured brand, a media creation, crafted to appear a successful self-made billionaire, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Trump inherited vast wealth from his father, engaged in questionable tax schemes, as revealed in New York Times investigations, and repeatedly used bankruptcy laws to avoid personal liability while leaving workers and small businesses unpaid. Johnston frames Trump as a grifter who manipulates the system to benefit himself while spinning narratives of victimhood and populist heroism. These mythological persona allow Trump to gain the trust of millions despite contradicting their real economic interest. He also goes ahead by defining Trumpism. Trumpism defined beyond the man, right? Trumpism, as Johnston and other analysts explain, it is not just about Donald Trump. It is a political ideology, a movement centered on nativism, authoritarianism, resentment politics, and deep distrust of institutions. It is marked by a strongman rhetoric, disdain for facts, rejection of democratic norms, and the Catholic devotion to a single leadership. Trumpism thrives on creating scapegoats, immigrants, the media, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ people, and global elites as a way to channel public anger away from corporate exploitation or systemic inequality. This ideology persists even without Trump in office, reshaping the GOP and national discourse. So you understand, it is not even about the Trump himself, but it is a political ideology, a movement which is centered in confusing Americans. Now, there is an important point that we also need to address when it comes to in line of the things that we are saying right now. Talking about the erosion of truth and accountability. One of the most dangerous elements Johnston identify in Trumpism is the systemic erosion of the truth. Trump routinely makes false claims, contradicts objective reality, labels anything that challenges him as fake news. This post-truth environment has led to a widespread disorientation in American civic life. Johnston warns that this weakening of shared facts undermines democratic governance, makes accountability nearly impossible, and creates space for authoritarianism tactics. When a population cannot agree on basic reality, it becomes vulnerable to manipulation and division. And that's what's really happening in this stance. Also, the weaponization of government power. Under Trump, Johnston notes how government institutions were increasingly weaponized for personal and political gain. from pressure the DOJ to investigate political opponents, to installing loyalists in key positions, to using presidential pardons to reward allies, Trump normalized a deeply corrupt use of executive power. Johnston compares the oligarchic behavior seen in authoritarian regimes, where the state becomes a tool for enrichment, the leader, and punishing dissent. The presidents now embodied the future political actors who may exploit weakened checks and balances. Also, there is a factor of economic betrayal of the working class. This happened in the year 2017. This is happening until today. You really can't note the difference, but it is something that is happening. Let's talk about it. Economic betrayal in the working class. Now, despite the populist messaging, Johnston argues that Trump governed in the interest of the wealthy. This is marked by the year 2017. The 2017 tax cuts and job acts disproportionately benefited corporations and the ultra-rich, while doing little to raise wages to reduce economic insecurity for average Americans. Meanwhile, deregulation under Trump put workers and consumers at a greater risk, and his trade wars disrupted agricultural and manufacturing sectors. Johnston sees this as a con. Trump claimed to stand with forgotten American while implementing policies that made their lives harder and their future less secure. Right. Let's talk about racism, xenophobia, and the politics of division. Trumpism relies heavily on racial and cultural fear to consolidate support. Johnston highlights how Trump repeatedly stalked white grievance, accusing Mexican immigrants of being rapists, implementing a Muslim travel ban, defending white nationalists in Charlottesville, and using coded language to appeal to supremacist factions. This racialized narrative has deepened social fractures in America, leading to increased hate crimes, polarization, and the erosion of multiracial democracy. Johnston sees this not as incidental, but as a core strategy of Trump's political identity. Also get to look at the impact of democracy and institutions. Johnston is particularly concerned about the long-term damage Trump has done to America's democratic institution. From attacking the legitimacy of election to spreading lies about voter fraud, Trump has seeded dangerous doubts about democracy itself. The January 6th insurrection, fueled by these lies, was physical manifestation of this erosion. Even after leaving office, Trump continues to push these narratives, influencing local and state GOP's officials to pass restrictive voting laws and reshape electoral system to enrich minority rule. This, Johnston argues, is a direct assault on the democratic process. Right. Also, the cult of personality and political radicalization. I was going to talk about this. Trumpism has transformed the Republican Party into a vehicle for personal loyalty rather than ideology or policy. Johnston describes how traditional conservatives who opposed Trump were purged or sidelined, while loyalty to Trump became the defining litmus test. This shift has radicalized the party's base, making compromise, debate, and shared governance nearly impossible. With Trump or his imitators still looming, the cult-like structure threatens to make authoritarianism a lasting force in American politics. Also, how is this affecting everyone today? That's an important question that you might want to ask yourself. For average American, the impact of Trump and Trumpism has been profound. Johnston points to increased political violence, a rising conspiracy theory like QAnon, growing mistrust in public health institutions during the COVID-19 pandemic, and worsening social divisions. Many Americans now live in separate realities, consuming partisan media that reinforce their fears and prejudice. This has led to broken families, community distrust, and a sense of national unraveling. Johnston sees this as a crisis of civic identity and cohesion that will not be easily healed. Also, how do you see the future of America without Trump in Trumpism? Even if Trump were to exit the political scene, Johnston argues that the Trumpism will persist as a movement. Its appeal to fear, resentment, and identity remains potent, especially in an era of economic precarity and cultural change. Republican candidates increasingly mimic Trump's tactics, language, and defiance of norms. This suggests that the challenge ahead is not merely defeating one main in an election, but confronting a broader authoritarian trend that now shapes a major political fraction in the United States. Right? So, definitely, let me know what you think about this. I'm your host and presenter, Agent Stories, and I'm hoping that you are doing fine or you're doing well from wherever you're watching us from. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony.